So let's talk about the murderous Tyranid Screamer Killer, a brutal looking model with some fearsome combat stats, but perhaps just a little bit expensive for what it really does. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids, and in this video I thought we'd do an overview of the Screamer Killer Carnifex variant in game, talking over its datasheets, damage output, and some comparative numbers against another monster. The Tyranid Screamer Killer is a reimagined version of the classic Screamer Killer Carnifex, perhaps one of Games Workshop's classic models that hadn't aged quite so well, but in all honesty I was kind of impressed with just how brutal and menacing they made this guy look, while still keeping some of the slightly weirder design features like the claws that arc inwards, and perhaps the slightly unintelligent looking face. I feel like with this body to back him up though, it just makes it look like a pretty mindless muscle-bound enforcer of the High Fleet, which I guess is what it really is. Initially the miniature was released in the Leviathan box, unfortunately it didn't make its way into the Tyranid starter sets. I'd guess that somewhere down the line it's probably going to get a re-release with the Tyranid Neurotyrant in a sprue set of its own. In the lore it's basically a variant of the Carnifex strain, and it had its rules represented by the standard Carnifex model in the previous edition of the game. A variant with its classic 4 massive scything talons, plus a bioplasmic attack that can melt through infantry, accompanied by its classic fearsome wail. In general I do quite like the new model that they've done for it. It does divide opinions a little bit, but I felt it was one of the better sculpts out of the Leviathan box. In game, here is its datasheet in Codex Tyranids, an 170 points monstrous creature, and I must admit I feel like the points cost is perhaps the single worst feature of the miniature. Its stat line and weapon damage is absolutely fine, but I think it's just priced a little bit higher than you'd maybe like for these kind of abilities. It's basically a mainline damage dealer that can't hide very well, and it perhaps struggles to have the durability statistics to go up with its points cost, and that's not really all that awesome for a model that's got the vast majority of its value for getting into melee. Overall it mainly does a whole bunch of combat damage at strength 10, has a bioplasmic scream that can take out 1 wound infantry quite well, and is at least fairly general purpose to chip a little bit of damage against most targets. I feel like its rules are generally written as quite an easy to use miniature, just literally throw it at your enemy. You're probably going to struggle to go too far wrong, though you do seem to pay a premium for that privilege. It moves 8 inches, which is kind of standard for Tyranids monsters, and a lot of the time you can afford to advance as well, due to the scream having the assault keyword. And then on the durability front, it's got 10 wounds, toughness 9, and a 2+ save. Putting that all together, I think it's just a little bit underwhelming for its points cost on the toughness side, though at least the 2+ save can be really quite valuable if you can get cover, perhaps just getting a little bit of gamey cover by one of those big stretched out claws hiding behind a bit of ruins or something. It's very easy to get cover saves in 10th. If it's out of cover, it averages around about 5 las cannon hits to bring one down. It's definitely a monster where dedicated anti-tank will make fairly short work of it, but anything mid-strength or low AP is going to struggle. For its ranged attack, its bioplasmic scream has d6+3 attacks at 18 inches, hitting on a 4+, and all at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 1. Kind of an interesting profile that one, there's not that many things that have that high strength, a fairly good AP but only damage 1. And it does mean that it's fairly general purpose, should be at least alright at chipping a little bit of damage against most targets, probably best against reasonably heavily armoured 1 wound infantry. It averages around about 3 or 4 termagants if you're getting some blast hits off, or around about 1 Dead Space Marine Intercessor from a squad of 5. As I mentioned, I think that the assault thing is really quite handy, means that you don't have to second guess between just walking it up normally if you can't charge to scream, or getting the extra movements to have better chance of charging the following turn. Basically, if it's not making a charge this turn, then you may as well advance. The blast keyword is kind of helpful, I think. Means you might get a few extra hits against certain enemies, though it does mean that you wouldn't be able to fire it against any units that you're in combat with, which is kind of annoying. Paired with the actual damage output of the scream, you get the Death Scream special rule. This forces your opponent hit by the bioplasmic scream to take a battle shock test, and it's a fairly potent one at that, as it gets you a -1 debuff to that test. Most of the time it means that enemies taking the debuff will have about a coin flip chance to fail battle shock. If you're starting from leadership 6, it'll be a 42%. If you're starting from leadership 7, it'll be a 58%. Basically odds on, but by no means guarantees. As with things that make battle shock happen in your own turn, it does have somewhat limited value, I think. Battle shock auto recovers in the next command phase, so it means that it's only actually useful for anything that you can do in your own turn, basically. It'll stop the opponent using stratagems, and the combat interrupt one could be useful, I suppose. And occasionally it could be important for secondary objective scoring, say the ones where you need to hold certain objectives in the midfield. If you battle shock your opponent and their objective control 0, then that's going to help with that. I feel like with the new Tyranids Codex, though, it might actually be most interesting with the addition of the new Neurolictor model. That's the one that actually makes Battle Shock kind of relevant. It means that if you got a Battle Shocked enemy within 12 inches of it, then you get +1 to wound with your attacks against that enemy unit. Really quite a big damage boost, and it also helps them not hit as well too if they say we're engaged in combat. That could be handy either just for the Screamer Killer's melee itself, or anything else that's focusing fire on the target. It is still going to be a bit random as to whether or not you trigger that up, and it does take a little bit of setup having 2 models on the board within range, but at least the payoff will be quite good when it does come off. Then pretty much the most exciting bit I think is the melee damage. The Screamer Killer gets to attack with its talons, 10 attacks at strength 10, AP 2 and damage 3. A very solid general purpose attack that's going to make a mess of most things that it goes into. It perhaps seems optimally suited for killing Terminators, wounding them on a 2 and then putting them down to their invulnerable save. You average around about 3 of them dead, which is really quite impressive. It was definitely good against standard intercessors, killing around 4. You'd expect around 5 or 6 dead hordes, and then for battle tanks it really depends on what their toughness is. If you're wounding on a 3+ against a Rhino tank, then you're going to do far better than against a Land Raider. Just in general though, it's going to stack some good damage and plenty of saves on just about anything that doesn't make it wound on a 5+. Overall I think the rules for the model are really quite fun. Reasonably mobile, as it doesn't really have any major disincentive to advance towards the midfield. Scream dead a few infantry and maybe battle shock something if it's relevant, and then try and get to grips with the enemy with a couple of rounds of melee. This hopefully should take a chunk out of most squads when you charge it into them. Unfortunately for it, I'd say the main issue that the Screamer Killer has is when you compare it to the other Tyranid monstrous creatures that you can field. Perhaps one of the most obvious ones for comparison both before and after the new Codex is the Haruspex, which if you just want a big dedicated melee nightmare of a bug, does just seem to have the numerical advantage, and its numbers are pretty impressive both in terms of damage and defense. Here's a melee damage comparison between the two. These are just the raw numbers for one model, not weighted for points or anything, though the Haruspex does cost 125 points where the Screamer Killer costs 170. In combat, one Haruspex will outcompete one Screamer Killer pretty handily against things like Termagants or Intercessors, and also really quite heavy targets like the Land Raider. It gets a bunch of high damage attacks that hit at strength 14, which all usually give it the edge against anything that's toughness 11 or 12. It's around about the same damage into something like a Rhino, and it's only really the Terminators that the Screamer Killers are better against in melee. The Screamer Killer averaging 8 wounds turn on turn, the Haruspex more like 6. Obviously that gets really quite a lot worse if you do adjust for points though. In terms of efficiency, the Haruspex is around about twice the efficiency against Termagants, and almost that much against Intercessors. Per point they do around about the same damage against Termagants, before being more significantly ahead against the heavier vehicles again. Otherwise for this particular number comparison, things don't really seem to get any better in terms of durability either. Just for one model, despite the Haruspex costing significantly less, it's better against all these 3 weapon types: overcharged plasma, autocannons and las cannons. It does have more like 14 wounds and a higher toughness characteristic, even if the save isn't as good. Again, that gets a fair bit worse though if you do wait for points, around about an extra 50% durability there. In terms of a fairly fun melee bug with one powerful shooting attack, the Haruspex does seem to have the Screamer Killer beat in terms of pure numbers, although maybe the comparison is perhaps a little bit harsh given that the Haruspex is perhaps surprisingly low costed for what it does. But at least going by the raw melee numbers, I kind of feel like the 2 monsters should have a fairly similar points cost really. And to me it just feels like it underlines how badly balanced they are, given that the Screamer Killer is 170 and the Haruspex is all the way down to 125. Still though, even though the numbers aren't really in its favour, I'm certain that a lot of collectors out there will be putting the Screamer Killer on the table regardless. It's a fun model, and lots of people have one from coming in the Leviathan box. For support for the thing within the Tyranid Codex, ideally it would want to be in Synapse range somehow. I guess being a melee monster that's charging towards the enemy, it might well find itself ranging forward. I guess ideally you'd need some sort of Tyranid Synapse creature to go with that, if you want to have a bit more insurance against it failing leadership if it happens to be on low health. Maybe something like a Maliceptor might be kind of reasonable to support. That's another Tyranid monstrous creature that's going to feel okay moving fairly fast towards the enemy, as it's fairly tough for the cost and wants to get its powerful psychic shooting in range. Otherwise, as mentioned earlier in the video, I feel like pairing a Screamer Killer with one of those new Neurolictors seems like a pretty reasonable idea. They're really quite efficient for the stats, just full stop, with lone operative and being surprisingly tough with their 4+ invulnerable save. They do seem to be quite good just to have in the front ranks anyway, and being annoying threats on objectives. In the Tyranid Codex though, while you do have Shadow in the Warp to put out a load of battle shock tests, the Screamer Killer is one of the models that can most reliably make an enemy test at -1, and then if they do happen to fail that battle shock test, then if they're within 12 inches of a Neurolictor, the rest of the Tyranid army gets a +1 to wound them, and that enemy unit gets -1 to hit as well. It just feels like between that pair you could make one enemy unit just massively easier to kill than it would otherwise be. If you hit them with the Screamer Killer Scream, then they'd have basically a sort of 50-50 chance for whether they're passing or failing Battle Shock most of the time. And if they fail it, then you can go to town on them with the entire Tyranid gun line or with +1 to wound, and potentially even the Screamer Killer's melee after it charges in. Definitely kind of unreliable, but seems nice if you could get that combo going on any big important enemy unit. It is unreliable, but I feel like Neurolictors are handy enough that you might just want them to have them around anyway, and if they do this every so often, then all the better. Otherwise though, the Screamer Killer can make use of the usual Tyranid synergies. Venom Thropes nearby can potentially give them cover, presuming they're not already able to get it from somewhere else I guess, and the Psychophage could give them a 6+ Feel No Pain. The Zone Thrope 6+ Invulnerable save just doesn't seem like it's usually going to be relevant on monsters with a 2+ save. Otherwise, Hive Tyrants could be pretty interesting to give them some free stratagems maybe. They could help out with Synapse, and being a fairly big expensive monster, the 5+ Feel No Pain from Invasion Fleet is pretty reasonable to put on them turn on turn, if they do wind up being targeted by enemy firepower at least. For the shiny new Tyranid Detachments, the Crusher Stampede is probably going to be an interesting one most of the time, given that that's got lots of support for monsters. That one's got the option for injured but not destroyed monsters to get a +1 to hit, and then ones below half health to get a +1 to wound as well. Might be kind of unreliable, though it's not impossible that you could trigger those sort of buffs with an automatic death throws on a monster nearby. You could even potentially target the Screamer Killer itself for that. It's only got Deadly Demise 1, so the taking a 1 mortal wound for a bunch of nearby monsters might actually be worth it for getting +1 to hit for loads of them in the next turn. Otherwise, there's one command point 1 to reroll hits in melee, I think with 10 strength, 10 attacks, and that's usable. There's another one command point 1 for mortal wound impact hits when you charge in, kind of useful for any monster really, but could definitely add to a bit of damage. Otherwise, I feel like the Invasion Fleet remains very strong. Their Feel No Pain type stratagem is really quite good for 1 CP, either with that or a Hive Tyrant, and I feel like he's usable with that given that he's quite a big expensive monster. And basically any of the damage buffs do seem to be relevant for him. I feel like he'd be particularly helped out by lethal hits if he happens to be tangling with things like enemy knights. They're a very big deal to his damage output if he was going to be wounding something on 5s. Finally, the Synaptic Nexus seems pretty good for the Screamer Killer. You've got multiple turns of useful buffs that are quite meaningful to it, either a 5+ Invulnerable to keep them safe, +1 to advance and charge, or +1 to hit in melee. Provided you did have the Synapse creatures to keep him in range, then all of those seem handy. Maybe you could run up alongside a Maliceptor or one of those new Norn emissaries. Otherwise, that one also does have a 1 command point for Battle Shock triggering a whole bunch of mortal wounds. You would need a Synapse unit nearby to do that, but again that could get you some extra value out of the Scream. Overall at the moment, in terms of raw strength in the army, I would say that he is likely to remain niche for his points cost while he's all the way up at 170. I feel like at this kind of points cost he's just really not competing against the other mainline damage dealers of Codex Tyranids, particularly the Haruspex by the numbers that we had earlier, but certainly in competitive lists, things like Old One Eye leading some regular Carnifexes perhaps, Maliceptors, Exocrines, Haruspexes, and even Trigons all seem to get played more in regular lists compared with the Screamer Killer. If I were using one in game though, I'd probably be most tempted to try and use one paired with the Neurolictor to try and get the big +1 to wound debuff on an enemy unit. As said, definitely not really reliable, but that's a massive debuff when it does trigger and could make your shooting a lot more efficient. And otherwise, the Screamer Killer is probably not really the most subtle of the Tyranids, just really wants to advance up the board each turn, scream something if he can, and then get into combat with something. Ideally elite infantry or Terminators feel like his ideal prey. I think you'll probably struggle to hide him from all enemy firepower as he moves up, as he just doesn't really quite move fast enough to jump from cover to cover. If he can stay out of line of sight of enemy anti-tank guns, then all well and good, but at the very least you could perhaps jot one of those big extending claws behind ruins so he gets a cover save. Here's perhaps a particularly easy model to have some part of him obscured from view, and the cover saves are very meaningful on him when he has a 2+ save to start with. In any case, I think he's a cool model with some fun rules. Could definitely do with dropping in points a bit though. Let me know your thoughts on these Screamer Carnifex down in the comments below though. How have yours been faring on the battlefield for you? Looking forward to hearing your thoughts and feedback. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and hopefully we'll have a fair bit more for the Tyranids coming out. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming, you can find that linked in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.